It's a great pleasure to give this lecture. This is a prize that myself and all people at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences are very happy about. And I would like to start with a few remarks. As we all know, and we have all seen, so this year's prize is shared by Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson. And the official citation for this year's prize is for improvements to auction theory and inventions of new auction formats. And this may sound like something which is very narrow, but as I will hopefully explain, this is a very general prize, and it's a prize that you can apply in your daily lives. Auction theory and the practice of auction design is also a large field. It's, as I will tell you, it was created in the beginning of the 1960s, and since then it has just been exploding. So I can only cover very little during my talk here today. Both Wilson and Milgram have made many important contributions to this field. I will only mention a few of them. Moreover, both Wilson and Milgram have made super important contributions to other fields, like game theory, financial economics, matching theory, and many other things. I will not even mention that. And finally, before I start, auction theory and the practice of auction design is really a teamwork. It is something that started 60 years ago, and there has been hundreds of important contributions in this field. I will not discuss any other names today except Wilson and Milgram, because if I would start mentioning other names, I would have to go on the entire day, because there are so many people that had made so many important contributions. And it's also important to say that this is not only economists. In fact, we have behavioral scientists that have made very important contributions. We have people doing empirics that has done important contributions. And there is also crossover to other disciplines. And in the last couple of years, we have seen this massive collaboration between economists and computer scientists. So this is a prize that started as a very small thing 60 years ago, but it has now exploded to other disciplines outside of economics. So with these remarks, let me start with my favorite slide. So first of all, auctions have been around for thousands of years in many different parts of the world. The first auctions were documented more than 2,500 years ago in China and in Babylon, and a bit later in the Roman Empire. So at that time, they typically sold what people consumed back then, so different crops and fish and stock and these things. But today, auctions are important than ever, because we have now new electronic markets, which we didn't have 2,500 years ago. We have now new products, we have more complex products, and auctions is a very good tool to trade and sell and buy different objects, as I will try to explain today. But let me first give you a few examples of how auctions affect your daily life, even if you may not think about it. So many of you have probably bought something on a popular internet auction site. I will not mention any specific names, because, but I guess that you know what I'm talking about. More than 1 billion people buy and sell things on popular internet auction sites every year. Many local and regional electricity markets are organized as auctions. So this will affect what you pay every month when you receive your electricity bill. Many financial instruments are traded using auction-like formats at stock markets around the world every day. And this will, for example, affect your retirement savings or savings in your bank accounts, or if you have investments. When the European Union in 2005 decided to start this inner market for global emissions, the auction mechanism that priced these emission allowances turned out to be key. And 30 years ago, and I will come back to this example later, when we saw new technological developments like cell phones and internet, the spectrum bands that we use to, for example, call in our cell phones, started to be massively over-demanded by different telecom operators and broadband providers and others, meaning that regulatory bodies and governments around the world started to sell the right to use parts of the radio spectrum on auctions. This is something that affects what you pay every month when you call with your cell phone. Another popular example, is not on my slide, is that typically whenever you go to a big internet page and you open your web browser, there is an auction that determines in the background what ads you will see based on your previous internet search history and cookies and things like that. So these are auctions that they go on every millisecond whenever you open a new web page. So auctions are everywhere, and sometimes we think they're good, sometimes we may think they are annoying, for example, what type of ads you will see when you open an internet page. But you cannot hide from the fact that they are everywhere. They also come in different forms. So it's not like there is one auction format. There are several of them, in fact, quite a few. But they also have different objectives. So some sellers may aim to maximize revenue. Like if we would say sell something on a popular internet auction site, we would probably aim for high revenues. But other sellers use auctions as tools to achieve other objectives. For example, on the electricity market, you would like to have a fair price. So you, on the one hand, guarantee the short-run electricity supply, while at the same time guarantee that you get the long-term investments in electricity grids and other things. Even central banks, so me and Torsten Persson, the secretary of the Nobel Prize Committee, we gave a talk yesterday at the Central Bank of Sweden. And for them, you know, when they buy and sell bonds and things like that, auctions are super important. But also in 2007, when there was this financial crisis all over the world, central banks like Bank of England, they used auctions to increase bank liquidity so they could avoid bank runs, which in the end made so savers didn't lose their money. And the idea with this CO2 emission allowance program is to reduce global emissions. So you can have many different goals and many different objectives with an auction. But it's not so easy to understand auctions. Even very simple auctions are difficult to understand. So suppose, for example, that you would participate in an auction to buy, say, a house or an apartment or something. And then you need to ask yourself many different questions. So, for example, when should you place your first bid? If you have been outbidded, when should you place your second bid? How large should your bid increments be? And you have all these different questions that you always have to ask yourself as a potential buyer when you participate in an auction. And the answer to these questions will give you your strategy, your bidding strategy. But the outcome of the auction is not only depending on your bidding strategy, it's also depending on the other bidders' strategies. So auctions are games of strategic interaction, where the different participants, players, or bidders, whatever you want to call them, have different strategies, and their strategies will determine the outcome of the auction. So to analyze auctions, you need to understand game theory. But the basic tools in game theory was not available until the 1950s and the 1960s, when John Nash and John Harsanyi made their important contributions, both of them Nobel laureates in 1994. So the first person that actually used these tools to analyze auctions was a researcher called William Vickery. He also received the prize in 1996. He analyzed something known as independent private values auctions. And that's a complicated name, but it's not as complicated as it sounds. So the idea is simple. Suppose that I participate in an auction to buy, say, a bicycle or something. If my value of this bicycle is 300, and I find out that Magnus actually values this bicycle at 500, that will not affect my valuation. I still think it's worth 300 for me. And most of us, we think about auctions like that. But if you think one more step, you will see that you will miss quite much by this simplifying assumption that my valuation is only determined by myself and there is no external events that influences my valuation. But suppose that you take some of the examples I just gave you. Suppose that you bid for the right to use a part of this spectrum band to provide broadband services or something like that. It's very difficult to estimate the value of owning a part of a spectrum band because you don't know anything about future technologies. You don't know anything about future demand and these things. And auction theorists like to call this a common value. So it's a value which is unknown beforehand, but in the end is the same to all bidders. So the Academy of Sciences, they have produced a number of different pictures and for our presentations, and this is a very nice one with the cats. So let me try to explain it using my this idea. So suppose that these cats are not cats, suppose that they are actually fishermen. So they would like to go out and fish. In many countries, you need to have some kind of fishing quota to be able to extract fish from the water. So many of these fishing quotas are sold in auctions. So the idea here is that you bid for the right to fish a specific quantity of fish in a specific water at a specific time. That's what you bid for. And so what is the value in this auction? The value is, of course, all the fish, the quantity of fish that you buy the right to extract from the water. But the value is not only determined by the quantity, it's also determined by the price. So if you can get 10 tons of fish and the price of fish is 10 whatever currency you use, then the value is 100 whatever currency you use. But when they place their bids on this auction, they may buy a fishing quota to fish something next month, and then they don't know the market prices. If they would know exactly how much they could sell the fish for, then of course they would know how much it's worth because they know the quantity, but they don't know the selling price. So they bid for something and they don't know the true value. So this is a common value auction. What has been observed by practitioners, but also by people doing more empirical and applied work, is that the most optimistic bidder often tend to overestimate this value, meaning that they overbid and therefore overpay for something. So the winner of the auction actually turns out to be a loser. This is what is known as the winner's curse. And you can see it here on this, on my slide here. So I use my pointer. So the idea here is that the real value of whatever we sell is this green cat. But different bidders, they have different estimates. So even if they on average are right, there must be someone that is above average, unless they all place the same bids, which is not very realistic. And that person, there is always then someone that overestimates the most. And this is the person that is struck by the winner's curse. So he thinks he's a winner, but in the end, he's a loser. And this is not a constructed problem. This is something that we have seen. But of course, practitioners, there's this famous paper from the beginning of the 1970s where people in the oil industry say, yeah, but even if you think it's worth this much money, you must be really stupid to bid as much, because if you overestimate, you will lose money. So a problem that Robert Wilson started to analyze was, okay, so given that we have these common values which are unknown beforehand, but in the end is the same to all bidders, how should rational bidders behave in these kinds of auctions? And he wrote a couple of papers in the 1960s and even more in the 1970s, where he made this distinction between private value auction, that is Vickery's framework, and his framework with common value auctions. And he presented the first equilibrium analysis in this type of auction game. So it's still a theory paper, but he did it. And his idea was essentially something like this. So suppose that you place a very high bid. That will increase your probability that you will win this auction. But if you place a very high bid, that will also increase the probability that you're struck by the winner's curse. So on the other hand, if you place a low bid, that will reduce the probability that you will win the auction. But on the other hand, it will also reduce the probability that you're struck by the winner's curse. So you need to find this kind of balance. So you need to shade your bids, or you need to reduce your bids optimally in order to avoid this. And this was a very nice insight. And I should also mention that he considered this in different informational environments. So in his leading example, which was the oil industry, so people bid for the rights to drill oil in a specific geographical area. And of course, you don't know how much oil that is in the ground. But Wilson also studied, so what if there is someone that is more experienced, someone that has already drilled oil in this specific region? Do they have some informational advantage over the unexperienced type of bidders? And analyzed situations like that and found optimal bidding strategies. And he was the first one to do this type of analysis in common value auctions. But unfortunately, the William-Vickery framework with only private values and the Wilson framework with only common values are special cases. In fact, most objects have both private and common values at the same time. So for example, if you take the examples I gave you when we started this lecture, take the electricity markets. So producers, they commit to supply electricity at some point, that they don't know the future market prices, so that's the common value component of this auction. But to produce this electricity, they use their own technology, and that is determined by, as I said, their own technology. And how much it costs me to produce a specific amount of electricity is not affected by how much it costs Magnus to produce the very same amount, because he may have another technology than I have. So the different production technologies should also play a role when we place our bids. So that will be some kind of private value. And the same thing when you bid for CO2 emission allowances. So if you don't buy them today, you may have to buy them in the future, and then you don't know the price of these emission allowances. But instead of buying these allowances, you can also try to invest in pollution control costs, meaning that you will actually have less emissions in your factories. You'll have to buy less emission allowances. So there is also some private component part in this. And when you start thinking about it, there is almost certain both private and common value components in all types of objects. So the auction theory by Paul Milgram, which started in the early, well, actually he published his first papers in the 1970s, but he really started to think about different information structures and different correlation structure between different private information. So he wrote a number of very famous papers in the beginning of the 1980s, and one of the, actually the most, the famous one is written together with Robert Webber. And this is an auction where it's a paper where they try to generalize this and include both auctions with private and common value in the same framework. And they also impose some statistical assumptions about the information structure. And what has been key to derive the results in their paper is that they assume something known as affiliation. And this is one way to structure the private information with the bidders. So it's really a statistical thing, but let's explain it like this. So suppose that you as a bidder can receive two signals about the value of something where you place bids. Then the signal can be either high or it can be low. So it's worth a lot of money or worth nothing, or there is a lot of oil, there is not so much oil, and so on. So you can receive this high and low type of signal. And what affiliation essentially means is that if you have, say, two bidders, then it is more likely that they both get signals that low or high, then one of them gets signal low and the other one gets signal high. So there is some correlation going on here in the information structure. And this will sort out many of the difficulties that they had to join these two different frameworks. So based on this, they could generalize many previous results. So they could include Vickery's framework, they could include the framework by Wilson in their model. And they could also derive a number of very interesting results. And some of them has become very famous. And it has to do with how this private information, how closely that is to how people place bids and how much you learn in the bidding process will affect the prices in the auction. So you can think about it as follows. So suppose that I would sell something to you, and I can use one auction format where you would place your bids, writing a sealed bid on a piece of paper. You will put it in an envelope and you will send it to me. I will open all the envelopes and the highest bidder wins. As a bidder, you don't learn much during that process. But if I would do a more like a traditional auction, an auction that we call an English auction, where I as an auctioneer would say, who is willing to pay 10? And then you raise your hand, and then I say, who is willing to pay 20? And then you continue to raise your hand. In that type of auction, you will actually learn something about the other bidder's private information. Because suppose that I'm very concerned about that I have overestimated the value of something. So I think that there is super much oil in this ground, but I don't know. I'm very afraid that I have overestimated that value. But if I in an auction can see that whenever I raise the bid, the other bidders tend to follow. And then I feel more secure that maybe I didn't overestimate the value. And therefore, I will bid more aggressively, which will lead to higher revenues for the seller. So what they could do with that type of result is that they could say, okay, we have 4 standard auction formats: the English auction, the Dutch auction, the first price auction, and the second price auction. And they could rank them in terms of expected revenue, which was a great thing to know when you design practical auctions. Then, of course, in many auctions, revenue is not the objective. And some auctions, it may be more interesting that they terminate fast than they generate the most revenue and so on. But it was a very important insight. And this result could also rationalize and explain why we often see that sellers share their private information with the bidders. For example, test drilling results, inspection protocols, and things like that. So it was a very nice finding. And then in the beginning of the 1980s, auction theorists had realized that, okay, so there are private value, there are common values, special cases, but now we had the joint framework to analyze it. Okay, and I should mention here that Bob Wilson, he consulted many electricity companies, and he also discussed with companies in the oil industry, and he was very interested in the practice of auction design. But to be honest, everything I mentioned so far, it's like construct something in a theoretical framework, which is nice because we need to understand theory to understand practice. But what really happened that would change everything in a dramatic way happened in the beginning of the 1990s. And here you need to think about, I was born in 1974, so I remember this very well. I was like 15 years old. So in the end of the 1990s, internet was around, but very few private persons, ordinary people, had access to it. Cell phones were also around, but very few people like you and me had access to a cell phone. But we all knew it was coming. Maybe not the internet back in the 1989, but you know, the tech companies, the regulators, the governments, they saw that something was going on here. And especially in the US, they noticed it because the regulatory body in the US called the Federal Communications Commission. So if you allow me to translate that into Swedish, it's the same thing as Post- och telestyrelsen here in Sweden. They saw that the number of applications started to grow because many firms wanted to have access to the radio spectrum. Before that, I mean, of course, there were like this cable TV channels and they wanted to have access to this type of network, but due to internet and cell phones coming in the near future, many people wanted to have access to these radio frequencies. Normally, these radio frequencies were assigned using some kind of administrative application procedure or sometimes even lotteries. And in some of these lotteries, there were thousands of participants. And when some of them won the lottery to get the right to use a specific part of the frequency band, they immediately sold that to someone else. So we had spectrum speculators taking part in lotteries just to resell if they were lucky enough to win. So then it was decided that we should, instead of having these administrative protocols or these lotteries to assign parts of the radio band, we should organize it as auctions. So that decision was taken in 1993 in the US, and in 1994, the first auction was supposed to run. The problem was that they didn't have an auction design. So they decided to do an auction, but they had no idea what the auction would look like. So they invited, as they often do in the US, different scientists and researchers and even private firms and lobbyists to come up with proposals about, you know, how should we design this auction. And the problem they faced, so this is a map from how the US was divided back in 1990. At that time, they had something like 2,500 licenses for the radio spectrum. Today, they have, of course, much more than that because of, at this time, the third generation, the fourth generation, and the fifth generation of mobile telephony didn't exist. But this is what it looked like. So what were the problems? So let me try to explain these problems using a simpler map that is easier maybe to understand. So take this map, and I should mention, in case someone from the Swedish regulatory office is watching this, I know that this is not how Sweden is divided into different regions of spectrum frequencies. This is just an example, but it's an important example because some bidders would like to acquire licenses so they can get coverage in the entire country. So they would only be interested to buy a license in the north of Sweden if they at the same time can get access to licenses to cover Sweden all the way down to the south. So these are the national bidders. We have other bidders, like the blue guy here. He's only interested to operate locally in the very south of Sweden. And then we have these two other bidders in my picture here with two colors. They are interested in some kind of regional coverage. So given that you have licenses, often hundreds of licenses that you should auction at the same time, and you have different bidders that regards these licenses as complements. So they're only interested to buy one thing if they can be guaranteed to get some other thing. And given that different bidders have different ideas about which licenses that complement each other, how should you design an auction format? So one thing is clear, you should probably not do it in a sequence, because you should probably not start selling in the north here, the red part, and then continue down to the south, because the person that is interested to get national coverage, for him it's very risky to start buying something in the north and not knowing if they would win the auctions that would come later, because then he may own something in the north which is only interested to own if it also can get accesses further down the south. So a proposal called the simultaneous multiple round auction was based on a proposal by Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson, and partnered together with Preston McAfee, I should also mention, sold this auction design by saying, okay, so it's very complicated to say that people could place bids on different packages. It's computationally demanding. We don't know if the market is mature for that yet. So let's instead sell all these licenses one by one, but in a sequence and simultaneous. So if you would like to have a package of different licenses, at least you can, they are all sold at the same time. And FCC, the regulatory body, they were very concerned about this auction design, because how will it even terminate? How can we guarantee that bidders even place bids and that the bids are raised sufficiently much and things like that? And so the key thing in this auction design was not only the simultaneous design, but it was also the creation of something known as activity rules that forces bidder to bid in a specific way, to stick to their bids in a specific way, and to force that the auction pushes forward all the time. So no one is strategically not placing any bids for a while just to, make life difficult for the other bidders. This auction was adopted in 1994 in the United States to sell radio spectrum, and I think the first auction was around 50 licenses, which was at that time quite a lot. Nowadays, the biggest auctions contain much more than that, 10 times more licenses than that. But it was a huge success. And in the last 25 years, this auction has been used, I think, in all continents over the world, including Sweden, to sell spectrum. But this was the first design, and it was a very intelligent and clever design, but it also had some weaknesses. So, for example, something known as the exposure problem, because bidders couldn't really place bids on packages. The different items are sold one by one simultaneously, but there were no package bids, so to say. There was also evidence that some of the large bidders that were large enough to affect the market engaged in strategic demand reduction. So they strategically reduced their demand to reduce prices on other licenses and things like that. So there was a new auction design called the combinatorial clock auction that Paul Milgram was one of the main innovator of. So he worked together with a bunch of not only economists but also computer scientists to design this format. In this auction, you could actually place bids on packages, and it turned out to be computationally very complex, and this is also why he needed assistance from these persons in computer science to solve this problem. And also this auction format has been implemented all over the world in the last almost 20 years now. And a version of this auction will be used here in Sweden next month when we sell the 5th generation of mobile telephony access to these parts of the spectrum band. We will use this auction. So it's also a very popular auction, but maybe the main auction design of them all is an auction called the incentive auction. And this is a very clever idea, actually, and it was designed by Paul Milgram and his team of economists and computer scientists and practitioners and many, many more problems. many more people, I should say. So here the idea was the following. So back in the 80s, different local TV channels were given the right to use parts of the spectrum band to broadcast their cable TV services. But they didn't use as much radio spectrum as they had been allocated. And given all these new technologies and the fact that different firms wanted to have more access to radio spectrum because of the increasing demand of broadband services, the idea was maybe there's some kind of imbalance. So this, small old network TV companies, they have access to all, to this much, and they have this new modern broadband services, and they don't have as much access. So maybe we can do an auction where we, in the first step, buy back radio frequencies from these local TV stations. So we say, okay, so you have something which is worth a lot of money. Can we please buy it from you in an auction? And when we bought it from you, then we resell it to the broadband providers. And in the end, this was, I should also mention in the middle there, they had to do some repackaging of the spectrum, and very complicated things, and they needed to have assistance from very technically skilled people. So the outcome of this, and remember, this is the first time ever I mention any type of number here, because these auctions, they turn out over billions and billions of dollars. But just to give you a flavor, so to buy back all these spectrum licenses from the network TV station, that costed around $10 billion US. And then it was resold for around $20 billion US. And the difference there ended up in the pockets of the taxpayers. So this $10 billion. And so both Wilson and Milgram have invented new auction formats for very complex markets. We have seen now that for radio spectrum, but their auction designs has also been used in other areas, for example, for electricity markets, emission allowances, fishing quotas, airport landing slots, all over the world in the last 25 years. I should also mention, because I'm running out of time, and this is my second last slide, so I should also mention that not all these auctions has been successes. You don't have to Google too much to find the failure of a big auction in some country. And sometimes this is because the auction format had the wrong design. Sometimes it is because there is not enough competition in the country to even use an auction. So it would have been better to use something else. Sometimes this is because there is this political game going on, that the decision to auction something off was taken at some point and then it's sold much later. And in this time window, bidders have time to collude, or other persons have the time to do things that to make money on this. So, but the point is the following: a carefully designed auction will lead to more efficient allocation. But then you need to pay attention to all details. So it's not like, yeah, this worked in the US, let's bring it over to Sweden and do the same thing here. You need to know everything about the market structure, and you always need to tailor these auctions so that they fit perfect the market that you have in mind. And this requires, of course, a lot of thinking, and it's important that you're careful. So let me just conclude here. So in the last 5 decades, and in fact still, Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson have changed not only auction theory, but they've also invented many new auction formats that have been used around the world. But as I started to say in my initial remarks at this talk, we should also remember that there are many, many other scholars that have contributed to this and made many important contributions, both in theory and in practical applications, and not only in economics, also in other fields. But what has come out of this is now that trained analysts can design new auction formats based on these ideas, and practitioners can choose more wisely among existing auction formats. And I myself personally and many others believe that this is to the benefit of not only the buyers and the sellers, but also often for taxpayers or end users and for the society as a whole. And that also concludes my talk here today. So thank you so much for your attention.